We recently had an online discussion on the movie The Steamroller and the Violin, and the purpose of this video now is to summarize my own thoughts, but also to record and discuss a bit the reactions of other people. I mean, it's always interesting in a meeting to see how other people think, what things they have thought that you wouldn't have thought otherwise, different perspectives, etc. So, just to complete this introduction, The Steamroller and the Violin is a movie by Tarkovsky, um, one of his early movies, which are not part of the canonical seven. It was made while he was a student. So because of its shorter length and also because he made as a student, and to be honest, because it's not really a movie that has the same status as the others, as Andrei Rublev or let's say Stalker, etc. It's not included in his usual movies. So if you just look online, you won't find this movie usually listed among Tarkovsky's works, and that's a kind of a pity because really it's a movie that is interesting to watch for people who are interested in Tarkovsky. Now, in this movie, there might be some small spoilers here, especially at the beginning, as I'm discussing what's happening in the movie. There are two protagonists. It's a young boy who plays a violin and a young worker who is a steamroller, hence the title. And one prominent theme, I think this was confirmed as well by the conversation we had on the Meetup, was that there are strange relations between these characters, especially the boy, but not only the boy. The steamroller also has a kind of not difficult, but a kind of a relation, let's say, with ups and downs with female co-worker, right? So the boy in particular seems to have some difficulty, let's say, in his relations with female characters in the movie. And there are several of them. There is a young girl who appears shortly. There is a scene with an apple that we discussed a bit on Meetup. I'm not going to discuss in length here because we cannot cover everything. But there is also the violin teacher. There is the female co-worker of the steamroller that I mentioned, and there is also, of course, a very important figure to discuss the movie and also to discuss in this movie with having in mind other movies by Tarkovsky, the mother figure, the mother. So yeah, there are these strange relations, and we mentioned the mother, and there's also the violin teacher, not teachers. That's a typo here. Let me fix that. And we also have the steamroller, who, unlike the mother, seems to be a very positive figure. One could even say an idealized father figure. So he's warm with the child, he provides guidance. The problem is that these two cannot really be together because they're not blood relatives. They're not relatives at all. They just met each other by chance. Now, and here is the major spoiler. People might want to avoid this part. It will not last more than a minute or so. So, in the end of the movie, as the boy returns home and is planning to meet the steamroller, so they had an appointment. Again, the movie, if I remember correctly, is from 1961, so it wasn't easy to schedule at the time. It just said, we're going to meet at 7 or 8 or whatever, be there. And as the mother comes home, she gets upset with the boy for various reasons, and she locks him in the room. Again, actually, Tarkovsky depicts this nicely, if I remember correctly, you can see the hand of the mother locking the door. So, for the boy, this is quite tragic because this action of the mother stops the boy from meeting with the steamroller. It's very clear from the movie that the boy looks up to the steamroller. He sort of sees him as a friend, a potential father figure, right? So this kind of ending suggests they might have never met again, because as I said before, there was no way at the time to keep in touch. And also because the steamroller doesn't see the boy, he gets disappointed, and he goes at the same movie that he was planning to go with the boy, he goes instead with a female co-worker. The female co-worker I discussed before. So this seems to suggest that, his interests, his priorities sort of change, right, symbolically, by turning to a woman. And however, the boy in his imagination has a fantasy, imagines that he does meet with a steamroller somehow in his mind. As we can see that they don't meet in reality, we can see them in the movie somehow joining in imagination. So this is where the major spoiler also stops. And this has given some rise to speculation, because Tarkovsky himself lost contact with his own father at a quite young age, and then he grew up with his mother, and if I remember correctly, also a sister. And there are hints that his relation with his mother was not so easy, it was a bit difficult actually. You can see that in his movie Mirror, and the title of the movie Mirror suggests there is something of an autobiographical or biographical element in this movie, which is not it's not very clear. I'm not saying this is a Tarkovsky biography, don't get me wrong here. I'm just saying that there are some elements of his own experience in life possibly in there. And at the same time that the mother in Mirror and here in this movie is depicted not as a bad person. Let me just be very clear about that. I'm not saying the mother is a negative or a bad character. Actually, her behavior is quite rational. Like she sees the boy, behaving somehow in an undisciplined manner as she tries to put him in order. It's not something unreasonable, but she's clearly somehow cold with him. And her role in the movie is somehow negative because she stops him from doing something he wants to do. At the same time that we see this, we see him how much he admires the steamroller, and we can make a connection here because we know Tarkovsky admired his own father, admired his poetry. If I remember correctly, he cites poetry of his father. There is not his cites. I mean, there are some citation of his father's poetry in the Mirror, and in general, we know from other works, interviews, etc., that Tarkovsky looked up to him also as an intellectual model. His father wrote some poetry. He also fought in the Second World War, in the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russia. So I think it's reasonable to say there are elements of his own personal life in this movie, and I would sum it up as a distant in the sense, not in the sense that he's aloof, a distant father in the sense that he cannot have a lot of contact with him because of against his own will, right? The father wants to be there, but for whatever reason, the war in reality or the circumstances in the movie don't let him do that. And the father, however, is warm and he's intelligent and he wants to guide and protect the boy. And you see this in the movie as well. And on the other hand, a mother, that is strict and is somehow restraining, limiting the boy. Note here what I mentioned earlier, that the violin teacher, like the mother, is also strict and focused on discipline. For instance, he doesn't let the boy express himself more freely when playing the violin. Like there is a scene where the boy plays the violin and the teacher puts the metronome and is really trying to make the boy play according to the rules. Right? He doesn't want him to be free and more expressive and show his real self. And that's, I think, a theme here. Now, I've seen this as a review actually. I think in Rotten Tomatoes, I believe it was from Time Out. It doesn't really matter. It's a reasonable thought to have. Some people might say, well, Tarkovsky was quite religious himself, and what we have here is a distant father, and the idealized version of this distant father So maybe, we can link his religiosity, if we see religiosity as an intense interest, a passionate interest in the search for an idealized father figure in God. And if we see it this way, then maybe we can trace Tarkovsky's religiosity to this childhood experiences. We can sort of psychoanalyze him, explain him in psychological terms. I think that's a bit far-fetched. Okay, I think it's an interesting and entertaining thought to have, and might give you some insights. But really, it's going a bit too far in my mind. Okay, that's just my thought. Now, some other themes. First of all, in relation. No, actually, let me continue with my notes. Tarkovsky had to please the authorities. That's a very important thing in the Soviet Union because, um, the censorship was stronger than in other countries, even after the Khrushchev thaw, right? And notice, for in this regard, in the regard, his relation to the authorities, which we know from later in his life, he was quite strained. The scene where a building is demolished, and one of the famous Moscow skyscrapers is revealed in the background. So this is a kind of attempt to flatter a bit the Soviet authorities, tell them the old past is removed and now we have the brilliant socialist reality, whatever. There is something we could call a class difference. I put it in quotation marks because we have to keep in mind that social classes in the Soviet Union work somehow differently than in the West. But in any case, I think people brought this up in the meeting. I think it's a reasonable thought that there is something of a class difference between the steamroller, who is a manual worker, although manual workers in many ways were glorified and got a quite good salary in the Soviet Union, by all means. And on the other hand, the more educated boy who lives in a more in what we would call in the West a middle class environment, good education, music, the mother wants him to play the violin, to do some intellectual work. Then some participants in our meetup, mentioned that the movie lacked the depth of his other movies, and to be honest, I also feel this way. I'm one of these participants, and it's reasonable. It's a first movie, it's a short movie. He didn't have the resources, he didn't have the experience for he had in his other movies. Also keep in mind this is a movie that in the intent, I'm talking about the intent now, was to be for a movie for children. I think adults can definitely watch this movie and enjoy it. It's not a movie that is childish in any way, but the intent is that. And where also Tarkovsky, this being a student film, is trying to showcase his skills to convince people, to give him an opportunity as a director. In this regard, keep this movie in mind, which you also had in a past meetup. The movie is Red Balloon. I believe it's from I'm quite certain it's from France. It's a bit earlier, from the 1950s. It is another movie for children, but which can also be watched by adults. And some people in the meeting, and I think there's a good point in that, show similarities between this movie, The Red Balloon, and Tarkovsky's movie. Okay, frankly, that's my own. I'm talking to myself now. If this movie wasn't made by Tarkovsky, I'm not sure I would have watched it. I think it's a good movie. It's a solid movie. It's a well-made movie with good acting and a thoughtful script. But it's not, it's not it won't. It's not a must-watch movie or anything like that. It's a movie we mostly watch because we want to have a fuller picture of Tarkovsky. And a thing I want to mention here, there are several names you see in this movie that you will also see in later movies, like the Steamroller, the actor who plays the Steamroller reappears in minor roles, usually in other Tarkovsky movies. But the most important name here is that of Andrei Konchalovsky. That's not his real name. His original surname was Mikhalkov. He's related he's the brother of the famous director who did burned by the sun. And he's one of, a very important figure, a very important person, filmmaker and scriptwriter in Soviet and Russian cinema, and he was the co-author of the script. So that's another thing to keep in mind. We don't only have Tarkovsky here, we also have Konchalovsky. And the final thing, okay, some people might feel this is far-fetched because I'm saying that there are elements of Italian neorealism. Usually wouldn't be described this way, but if you think about it, it's a movie about everyday reality. And there is a contrast. This movie made in the 1960s with a movie, let's say, made in the 30s. Actually, a movie they mention quite often. Um, a movie from the 30s, a war movie. I don't remember his name now. They are going to watch actually this movie. It's a very famous movie from the 30s that is very different because this is movies from the 30s would be what we call Soviet realism. So it would be a very kind of ideologically staunch movie that has the right kind of message. This one pays more attention to the details of everyday life. Slow pace movie, and that's why I'm saying it has some neo-realist Italian realist elements. I'm not necessarily saying that Tarkovsky was inspired by Italian directors. I'm just saying there are some similarities here. And in this regard, just to mention another movie that I think is interesting for people who like Soviet cinema, we have Walk in the Streets of Moscow, where Mikhalkov, the brother of Konchalovsky mentioned earlier, stars in this movie. And this is a movie about young people having a life in Moscow, just walking around, meeting other people, love affairs, everyday life really. The relationship with her mother or relatives. So that's all in all. I hope there were some interesting points here. It's a movie that's not very well known. That's another reason I wanted to have this because you won't easily find information about this movie online. Some of these thoughts I took from sources, other sources I mentioned, Wikipedia, I mentioned also Rotten Tomatoes. But some other things, are things that came up during our conversation, and I hope to see you guys again soon.